They didn't know he was listening. We were halfway through dinner when Tiffany's uncle set his fork down, leaned back in his chair, and said, "She's raising that child like it's a charity case." The laughter that followed didn't come from strangers. It came from my own family. Tiffany, my brother's wife, chuckled softly like it was a private joke she had to share. She looked at her wine glass, not at me. Then my Aunt Cheryl, who'd spent the whole evening making sideways comments about public school lunches and kids with no daddies, added, "Even strangers can tell he was an accident." No one stopped her. No one flinched. The table fell quiet like that kind of cruelty was normal. I didn't say a word. Not because I agreed, not because I was afraid, but because, in that moment, I couldn't find a version of myself that they would hear. So I swallowed hard and looked at my son. Jude was sitting quietly, legs swinging beneath the dining room chair that was still a little too tall for him. He was holding his napkin in his lap with both hands. His eyes were fixed on the mashed potatoes, but I knew he'd heard every word. And then, without a sound, he stood up. He stood up on his chair, his small frame rising above the table where the adults sat full of judgment, and he pulled a folded piece of paper from his backpack. "Grandma wrote this about Mom before she died," he said, his voice loud enough for every single person to hear. "Want me to read it?" He wasn't crying. He wasn't scared. He was 6 years old and standing tall with my mother's letter in his hand like it was a sword. Every fork stopped moving. The air turned sharp. My heart stopped in my chest because I didn't even know he had that letter. I hadn't planned to go. When Marcus called and invited me to Sunday dinner, I hesitated. My brother's house is beautiful, one of those spotless Virginia homes with white columns and an oversized front door that opens straight into a Pinterest catalog. It's the kind of house where silence is staged and emotions are polished. I didn't fit there, and neither did Jude, but he begged to see his cousins, and I wanted to give him a little bit of what other kids have. I told myself I could handle a few hours. I told myself it would be fine. We arrived 10 minutes early. Jude was clutching a Lego minifigure in one hand and my other hand in a tight grip. His shirt had a tiny juice stain I had missed that morning. I wiped it with my thumb and smoothed his hair. "You look perfect," I whispered. He grinned at me, already bouncing up the front steps. Tiffany answered the door with her usual half smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. Her blonde hair was pulled into a high ponytail, and her outfit looked like she hadn't so much as leaned on a chair all day. She glanced at Jude, then at me. "You made it," she said. "We were just setting the table." Marcus came around the corner and hugged me tight. He's always been the buffer between me and the rest of them. He's the oldest, the golden one, and for a long time he tried to protect me. But since marrying Tiffany, that instinct had dulled. He was still kind, just quieter. Jude darted off to play, and I followed Tiffany into the kitchen. She handed me a stack of plates and motioned toward the dining room. "I don't know how you do it," she said, not looking up from the salad. "Raising a kid without a real partner? I'd go crazy." I smiled without warmth. "You get stronger when you have no choice." She nodded but said nothing else. The dining room was crowded. Uncle Roger had come, which was rare, and my Aunt Cheryl was already pouring herself a second glass of wine. Their voices filled the room, loud, opinionated, sharp. Roger always had something to say about politics, money, or parenting, usually all three. Cheryl could take anything you were proud of and find the flaw in it. We sat down, and I took the seat farthest from them. Jude climbed into the chair beside me and started filling his plate. He was polite and quiet, careful the way he always was in rooms where adults spoke too freely. Dinner started fine. Safe topics: school, summer camps, Marcus's new promotion, Tiffany's yoga certification. I mostly listened. That was my role: smile, nod, pass the rolls, and pretend I didn't notice the comments with invisible daggers. Cheryl asked where Jude was going to school next year, and I told her we had enrolled in the local public magnet program. "Oh," she said, stretching the word like taffy. "They take anyone, don't they?" I didn't answer. Roger leaned in a little. "You ever think about a charter? There's one over in Fairfax. Might be worth it. Give the kid a real shot." Again, I didn't answer. I just focused on my plate. I had learned over the years that speaking back only fed them. Silence was my only shield. But the truth was, I had thought about it. I had looked into every option. I had picked up extra shifts, sacrificed weekends, filled out scholarship applications at 2 in the morning. Every decision I made had Jude in the center of it. Every dollar I spent was weighed against his needs. They didn't ask about that. They never asked about the work. They saw the result: my thrift store purse, my 10-year-old car, Jude's mismatched socks, and mistook it for failure. They didn't see the discipline, the nights I cried in the shower, or the pride in Jude's voice when he read his first chapter book on his own. As I looked around that table, I realized something I had known for a while but never wanted to admit. I was tolerated, not welcomed, judged, not understood. Every seat was filled with someone who saw my life as a cautionary tale. Still, I stayed. For Jude. Because he deserved a family, even if it was only partial and conditional. I reached under the table and squeezed his hand. He looked up and smiled, a smear of mac and cheese on his cheek. That moment, his smile, his innocence, was the only thing that made me feel real in that room. I didn't know what was coming. I didn't know that within 10 minutes they would say the words that broke something I had spent 6 years carefully building. I didn't know that Jude had something tucked inside his backpack that would remind every single person at that table who his mother really was. The moment it started, I felt it. It was in the way Roger leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms like he was preparing for a monologue. It was in the way Cheryl dabbed the corner of her mouth, her eyes scanning the table like she was waiting for a line she could pounce on. And it was in the way Tiffany gave a little hum, the kind she made when she didn't want to say something out loud but definitely wanted it to be heard. Jude was telling Marcus's daughter about a science project he made. His face was animated. His hands waved in the air as he described a volcano made out of papier-mâché and baking soda. He was proud. He was beaming. Then Roger spoke. "She's raising that child like it's a charity case." His voice cut through the moment with surgical precision, calm, icy, loud enough for everyone to hear, quiet enough to pretend it was just an observation. I froze. No one looked at me. That was the worst part. They looked at their plates, at their glasses, at each other. But not at me. Tiffany let out a small laugh and glanced toward Roger. "He does have that sweet orphan energy," she said like it was a compliment. "So well behaved, considering." Marcus didn't say anything. He didn't look at me either. He adjusted his napkin and took a sip of his drink. I reached for Jude's cup and refilled his water. My hands were steady, but my throat burned. Then Cheryl joined in. "Even strangers can tell he was an accident," she said, as casually as if she were commenting on the weather. That line didn't come out like a joke. It came out like a final judgment. A sentence passed down without emotion or hesitation. Jude didn't look up. He was still. His hands rested on the table, motionless. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could see the way his shoulders shifted, just slightly inward, like he was trying to fold himself smaller. I wanted to speak. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. The words I needed didn't form. My chest was tight. My pulse pounded in my ears. I thought about all the nights I stayed up with Jude when he had fevers, all the times I counted pennies to buy him school supplies, all the stories I read him, the lunches I packed, the tears I wiped. None of it mattered to the people at that table. They didn't know him, not really, and they didn't care to. They saw me as a mistake, and they saw him as proof of it. I looked at my brother, willing him to say something, anything, but he stayed silent. His face was neutral, carefully blank. He had learned to survive this family by blending in, by never pushing back. Tiffany smiled at him, her hand resting on his arm like she'd won something. I looked down at Jude. He was still watching his plate. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward me. His eyes were glassy, but not from tears. He wasn't sad. He was confused. He was trying to understand why people who were supposed to love him were saying things that didn't make sense. He didn't look angry. He looked betrayed, and that was what cracked me. I reached under the table and squeezed his leg. He didn't flinch. He looked back at the table, and in that moment, I knew he was storing this away. Jude didn't forget things. He would carry this with him. I hated that. Aunt Cheryl reached for another roll as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just labeled a 6-year-old a mistake. Roger took another sip of his drink. Tiffany looked proud of the quiet she had helped create. And I just sat there, still, silent. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew if I started, I wouldn't stop. I would unload years of humiliation, years of being patronized, ignored, judged. I would ruin dinner, and Jude would see a side of me I had worked hard to keep tucked away. So I waited. I told myself I would speak to Jude about it later, gently in the car when the air was safer. I would explain that some people confuse cruelty with truth. I would remind him that his worth was not theirs to define. But then he moved. He didn't say a word. He just reached down to his backpack, zipped it open, and pulled out something folded in thirds. His hands were small, but sure. He climbed onto his chair like he did when he practiced lines for school plays, and he held up the letter. His voice was clear and strong. "Grandma wrote this about Mom before she died. Want me to read it?" And for the first time all night, every single person at that table looked up. The room went still. Jude stood on his chair, his small frame rising above the table, holding a folded piece of paper in both hands. His voice had been calm when he spoke, but it cut through the tension like a blade. "Grandma wrote this about Mom before she died. Want me to read it?" No one answered. Roger shifted in his seat. Cheryl cleared her throat. Tiffany glanced at Marcus, who looked suddenly uncomfortable, like the table had tilted beneath him. No one looked at Jude. But I did. He didn't look scared. He looked steady, like someone who had been holding something heavy and finally decided to put it down. His hands were tight around the letter. I had never seen it before. I stood up slowly and reached for him. "Jude," I said softly, "you don't have to." He turned his face to me and shook his head once. "She said I should read it when people are being mean to you." My throat tightened. I looked at the envelope in his hand. My name was written on the front in my mother's handwriting. The ink was faded, the folds worn. I couldn't believe he had kept it. I couldn't believe she had written it. Jude had met my mom. He was just 5 when she passed, but she had loved him with a kind of fierce, unshakable devotion. She once told me he made her feel like her life had started over. She said he was the best thing that had happened to our family, even if not everyone could see it. He opened the letter carefully, his small fingers smoothing it flat against the tablecloth. No one moved. "I'm going to read it," he said again, his voice firmer this time. I sat down beside him and placed my hand gently on his back. He didn't need encouragement. He wasn't doing this for applause. He was doing this because he believed in it. He looked at the letter and began to read. "Elise, if you're reading this, someone is making you feel small again. Someone is making you question what you've built. Don't let them." He glanced up briefly, scanning the table before continuing. "You've always carried more than anyone should. You've always protected others before yourself. And I know you don't hear this enough, but I am proud of you." My hands gripped the edge of the chair. The voice of my mother filled the room through the soft, determined voice of my son. Her words reached past the shame and pulled something buried back into the light. "You are not broken," he continued. "You are not lost. You are not a mistake." I looked up. Tiffany's face had gone pale. Roger sat back with his arms crossed, staring down at the table. Cheryl was blinking slowly, as if she didn't know where to look. Jude's voice remained steady. "You are the fiercest, gentlest mother I have ever known. You carry love like a shield. You give it without asking anything back. I don't worry about Jude, because he has you, and that means he has everything." Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but I didn't cry. I held still. I let the words settle into the room like smoke filling every space they had tried to hollow out. Jude continued, "He is not your weakness. He is your legacy. He is what you've done right." He folded the letter back along its creases and looked at me. "That's what Grandma said." My voice caught in my throat. I wanted to speak, but I couldn't. I wrapped my arms around him and pulled him close, pressing my lips to his temple. He let me hold him for a moment before sitting back down in his chair. No one spoke. Marcus finally broke the silence. "I didn't know Mom wrote that," he said, his voice low. "I didn't know Jude had it." I looked at him. Neither did I. He nodded, staring at his plate. Tiffany pushed back from the table. Her face was unreadable. She stood, murmured something about needing to check the roast, and walked out of the room. Roger stood up next, muttering that he had an early morning. Cheryl followed without a word, Within minutes, it was just me, Jude, and Marcus sitting at a table that had felt like a courtroom only moments earlier. Jude was still. His head was tilted slightly, waiting to see what happened next. I smiled and squeezed his hand. "You did good," I whispered. He smiled back. Grandma said I should be brave. He was. He had done what none of the adults could. He had spoken with honesty, with love, without cruelty or pride. He had reminded them, and reminded me, who I was, and more importantly, who he was. Jude's letter changed everything, not because it silenced the room, that had already happened, but because it forced them to look at him, to really look, not as an awkward presence at the table, not as a child born from a story they disapproved of, but as a person, a small boy with a voice and a mind and a heart strong enough to carry my mother's words like a torch. Tiffany returned to the room a few minutes later, holding a tray of dessert she probably wished she could use as a distraction. Her smile was tight, the one she saved for PTA meetings and uncomfortable conversations. She placed the tray on the table, cleared her throat, and said, "Anyone want pie?" No one answered. Even the kids had gone quiet. Jude looked up at her. "Did you like what Grandma said?" he asked. She blinked. "What?" "In the letter. Did you like it?" She hesitated, then nodded. "It was sweet." "It wasn't supposed to be sweet," he said, looking at her without blinking. "It was supposed to remind people to be kind." Tiffany didn't respond. She looked down, then turned to Marcus. "Could you help me in the kitchen?" Marcus didn't move. Instead, he reached for the letter still sitting in the middle of the table. He unfolded it and read the lines again silently. Then he looked at me. "I wish I'd seen this sooner," he said. "I wish I had said something." I didn't need to hear it out loud, but I appreciated that he said it anyway. "You still can," I said quietly. He nodded, then looked at Jude. "Hey, buddy, that took a lot of guts." Jude nodded. "Grandma said bravery is doing something even when it's scary." Cheryl re-entered the room holding her purse, her face unreadable. She paused in the doorway, glanced at the pie, then back at me. "For what it's worth," she said, "your mother was always too soft on you. But she did love you. She talked about you all the time at Bridge." "She wasn't soft," I replied. "She was strong in ways you never noticed. She just didn't need to humiliate people to feel it." Cheryl's eyes narrowed. "Well, maybe we'll do this again at Christmas." "Maybe," I said, and I meant no. Roger had already left. He hadn't said goodbye. That didn't surprise me. When the table finally cleared and the noise of the house softened, I helped Marcus clean up while the kids played outside. We didn't talk much, just exchanged a few words here and there. But something had shifted. I saw it in the way he kept glancing at the letter, in the way his hand lingered when he passed it back to me. "She was always proud of you," he said. "Even when things got hard, I knew that. I just didn't know what to say." "You didn't have to say anything," I told him. "You just had to stop letting them speak for you." He nodded. When we left, Jude said goodbye to his cousins like nothing had happened. His voice was cheerful, his steps were light. But as we walked down the front steps, he reached for my hand and held it tightly. "Was Grandma mad when she wrote that?" he asked. "No," I said. "She was proud of us." He thought about that. I felt like I did something big. "You did," I said. "You reminded people who I am." We got in the car and I started the engine. The air was cool. The sun was starting to set behind the trees lining the driveway. "Can I keep the letter?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "You've taken good care of it." He folded it gently and slid it back into the front pocket of his backpack. Then he sat back in his seat and stared out the window, watching the trees blur by. Inside that house, they had tried to reduce our lives into punchlines and judgments, but outside, in the quiet of the drive home, I felt something stronger than their opinions. I felt clarity. They couldn't decide who I was. They never could. I had let their words linger for too long, let their disapproval sit in the corners of my mind like stains I couldn't scrub out. But now I saw it clearly. I wasn't a mistake. Jude wasn't a burden. We were not something to be whispered about after dessert. We were a family, built not from tradition or approval, but from love, persistence, and truth. The kind of truth that echoes even after the last voice goes quiet. Jude leaned his head against the window and said, "Next time someone's mean, I'll just read the letter again." I smiled. "Or you can just remind them who you are." The next morning, the letter was still on the kitchen counter. Jude had placed it there before going to bed, folded neatly, his name scribbled on a sticky note next to it. "Can we put this in a safe place?" he had asked, "so we don't lose it again?" I picked it up and read it one more time before sliding it into a plastic sleeve and tucking it into the back of a photo album. Not hidden, just protected. It didn't need to be displayed. It had already done what it came to do. The letter had started as something private, written by my mother to remind me of my worth when I might forget. But it ended up doing more than that. It exposed what silence had allowed to grow in our family: judgment, casual cruelty, and the kind of arrogance that disguises itself as tradition. And it reminded me that the truth has more power than performance. That dinner changed something in me. I used to believe staying quiet was the same as staying strong. I thought if I endured long enough, people would eventually see who I really was. But what I learned that night, watching my son stand up for me, was that sometimes silence doesn't protect peace. Sometimes it protects harm. Jude didn't wait for permission. He saw something wrong and he spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult anyone. He just told the truth. And the truth made them uncomfortable because it didn't leave room for the stories they had written about us. Tiffany didn't call the next day. Neither did Cheryl. I didn't expect them to. But Marcus did. He apologized again. Then he asked if Jude would like to come over next weekend to play. I said yes because Jude still deserved the cousins, even if I no longer needed the table. At work that week, I caught myself standing taller. I walked into parent-teacher conferences without shame. I stopped making excuses when people asked about our life. I stopped qualifying my joy, softening my love, or explaining my choices. When Jude's teacher told me he was thriving, I smiled without hesitation. When a parent asked where his father was, I said, "He's not in our lives. But we're more than okay." Because we are. I'm not perfect. I'm still tired. I still worry about bills, about the future, about whether I'm doing enough. But I no longer carry the weight of their opinions. That weight belonged to them. Jude started keeping the letter in a small wooden box on his dresser. Next to it, he placed a picture of my mom holding him as a baby. He says it's his truth box. He told me he might write his own letter someday in case I forget again. I told him I won't forget. But if he writes it, I'll treasure it anyway. That night at the dinner table was never about just one comment. It was about years of being underestimated, years of being dismissed, and the quiet, steady way those things pile up until you start to wonder if they're right, but they weren't right. Not about me, not about Jude. They were wrong, and now they know it. People love to tell stories about others when they think no one is listening. They assume their words will land quietly, without consequence. But my son was listening. And because of that, they had to hear the truth out loud. When I first became a mother, I was terrified. I didn't know if I was strong enough to raise a child on my own. I didn't know how to build a home with no blueprint, no partner, no guide. But I found a way. Not perfect, not polished, but real. And now every time I look at Jude, I know I didn't raise a child in weakness. I raised a child in strength, a child who stands when others sit, who speaks when others stay quiet, who tells the truth not to hurt but to heal. He's not an accident. He's not a charity case. He's not a mistake. He is mine. And I will never again let anyone reduce what we've built to something that fits inside their version of acceptable. Because this is our life, and it's exactly what it was meant to be. Thank you for listening to my story. If this reminded you of anything you've lived through, if you've ever felt judged, dismissed, or underestimated for doing your best, I hope you know you're not alone. Sometimes, the people who say the cruelest things are the ones who understand you the least, but your truth still matters. Your story still matters. If this resonated with you, take a second to like the video. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that their worth isn't up for debate. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, your stories, your moments of quiet bravery, or just what this made you feel. And if you want more real stories like this one, hit that subscribe button. We've got more coming. Stories about strength, about family, about the small moments that change everything. Thanks for being here. I'll see you in the next one.